Welcome back to Reliable Sources. I'm Brian Stelter. Today, 18 of the embassies that were closed because of terror threats last week reopened. One is still closed, and it's the one in Yemen, which underscores how that country is now a central front in the largely secret war against al-Qaeda. So why are there so few Western reporters living and working there? And how does that journalistic vacuum affect the way we understand what's going on? Joining us now live via Skype from the Yemeni capital, Sana'a, are two of those Western journalists. Freelance reporter Adam Barron and Iona Craig, the Yemen correspondent for the Times of London. Also joining us from Atlanta, Jeb Boone, a former managing editor of the Yemen Times and now a Global Post correspondent. Thank you all for being here, and thank you all for coming in via Skype from Yemen. Sometimes this can be tricky, which really shows how hard it is to cover the news there. I wanted to start with Iona and talk about what a typical day in the life for a reporter in Yemen is. Iona, is it relatively safe for you? Are you able to move around pretty freely?
Yeah, I'm able to move around pretty freely. You know, I head out in the mornings. I normally pick up some bread from the baker's that's just outside my front door for breakfast. I live right on a busy market and head out for meetings. Most of the interviews I do here when you're talking to Yemenis, I don't think I've ever done one that's lasted less than an hour. You know, people will sit down and spend a lot of time talking to foreign journalists here. But the only thing I do to take precautions is I do wear an abaya now and a hijab just to blend in a bit more because of the recent issues over foreigners being kidnapped.
Adam, do you find interest from editors back home and from bosses back home in the stories that are happening there?
I think I'm lucky that the two main outlets that I write for in the U.S., CSM and McClatchy newspapers, tend to take a pretty nuanced view, so they're always interested in stuff. But it's very clear that there are certain things, like anything AQAP related, obviously, as the past week has shown, that get disproportionate attention compared to, the political things or more humanitarian related stuff.
So in other words, the war coverage is taken much more seriously than the human stories there.
Yeah, I'd say so.
And Jeb, how does that affect how Americans perceive what's going on there? If we don't see it on television every day, if we don't see live shots from there and foreign correspondents parachuting in, how does that affect how Americans perceive it?
Americans don't realize just how deeply involved we are in Yemen and how many drone strikes have happened just this past week. There's been so many. And it's important to realize that while no one is in these areas, these rural areas where the drone strikes are happening, it may seem sort of a distant occurrence, hard to keep in touch with, and also keep that in mind when the media reports on these types of drone strikes. They're relying on reports from elsewhere, and they might not quite be sure what's going on either.
Iona, when we talked earlier, you made a point about how this reminds you in some ways of Iraq and WMD from many, many years ago, because you say Western journalists are spoon-fed information. Can you give us an example of that?
Yeah, I mean, that's really come out this week. Most of the coverage that's come from Yemen has not just been misleading. It's been complete and utter codswallop. You'd probably believe, or the people in America would believe, that we're on lockdown here, that we're under a siege. And the reality is, here in Sana'a this week, nothing has changed. It's absolutely normal. The amount of soldiers on the streets, there has been no heightened security. And the only difference has been this US surveillance plane that was buzzing over the city for several days. So, yeah, and the spoon-feeding aspect is that all of this was instigated by, unnamed officials in the White House in Washington without any verification of that. And people, the media organizations have completely swallowed that information without questioning it or actually using their own brains to think whether that may or may not be correct. And that's similar to what happened with the Iraq story. So this has all been sort of hugely hyped up here as a pretext then, as Jeb mentioned, this kind of soaring number of drone strikes this week.
Adam, I suppose if there's any optimistic take on this, it's that you all are there and that thanks to Skype and Twitter, you're able to get the word out in a way that people couldn't do 10 and definitely not 20 years ago.
Yeah, I can't imagine what it would be like to do this prior to the internet and stuff. And right. I think when it comes down to it, I think when you look at me and Iona and our other colleague Casey Coombs' coverage, it's very clear the difference between someone who's writing about Yemen from Washington, D.C. or Cairo versus writing from Yemen. And I think when it comes down to it, one of the reasons why there's such an issue with a lot of coverage of Yemen is that it's being covered from elsewhere, when this is a country that you really need to be deeply enmeshed in to really understand.
That's a great reminder for all journalism, for that matter, the value of being on the ground. Adam, Iona, Jeb, thank you for joining us.